Car enthusiasts love to sing the praises of sports cars. We're almost fanatical about anything built according to the principles of lightweight, big power, and sleek design. And yet, there is a sad irony in the fact that, relatively speaking, no one's actually buying sports cars. We wax lyrical about the Lotus Elise, and yet we all end up buying the Ford Escape. It's no wonder then that sports cars, in their purest form, are going out of fashion. And yet, despite the slow decline of the sports car, there are those of us who wish to keep the flame alive, notably Toyota with this, the 5th generation Supra. It's a car they gave up on many years ago, but have now resurrected. But is it the dawn of a new era, or another potentially futile roll of the dice? One that, without commercial success, might possibly be the true pure sports car's last hurrah. The birth of the new Toyota Supra hasn't been a particularly straightforward one. You see, to minimize the costs and mitigate the risk of failure, Toyota had to forge a technical partnership with BMW, one that serves as the basis of this, the new Toyota GR Supra. GR is their racing division, and the new BMW Z4. Now, Toyota will of course tell you that their interpretation is unique and special, and from the outside, it is. This is a striking car to look at, especially in this shade of lightning yellow. It's all big haunches, fluid lines, and raw aggression. But inside, it feels a lot less like a technical partnership and more like Toyota borrowed BMW's homework. All the buttons and switches are recognizable as BMW items. This iDrive selector knob is straight out of a Beamer. Even the infotainment system is lifted straight from BMW. Hell, the key, well, that's a BMW item as well. This car is about as Japanese as Frankfurters. There's also plenty of borrowing where the drivetrain is concerned. Toyota has avoided developing its own engine and transmission. Instead, they've borrowed an engine from you-know-who. In this case, it's the tried and trusted B58, the 3-litre straight-six that you'll find in the hot version of many of BMW's cars. There's nothing too wrong with that. After all, they've stuck to the Supra's roots by using a straight-six to drive the rear wheels. But there are a couple of very unavoidable elephants in the room here. First of all, that engine isn't paired with any kind of manual gearbox. No. Instead, what we have is a bog standard 8-speed ZF automatic. Yeah, sacrilege, I know. And this particular variant of engine only makes 335 horsepower. That's only around 10 horsepower more than the old twin-turbo Supras made 20 odd years ago. And then there's the very important fact that the engine in the BMW Z4, this car's main rival, or brother, well, that makes around 50 horsepower more than the Supra. If you're one of these people that are thinking we're being shortchanged with a car that hasn't really moved on in 20 years, and one that uses less powerful knockoff hand-me-down components, well, you might have a case. On the road, the Supra doesn't immediately reveal itself to be this barnstorming sports car. It might look like it's going to rip your face off, but it's actually quite easy to live with. There's not an awful lot of road noise or wind noise, the seats are comfortable and supportive, and it uses an adaptive suspension system, which in the normal mode is really compliant. It's actually doing a really good job of ironing out any imperfections in the road. I haven't done a long distance drive in this car as yet, but I absolutely wouldn't hesitate to do one. It's that compliant. I don't know whether this is a compliment or a slander, but in many ways, this Supra is, well, it's very BMW-ish. And you might be wondering what it is that Toyota has brought to the party. It's important to remember, however, that Toyota has a long history of producing iconic sports cars, many of which are more than just the sum of their parts. Their back catalogue is less about what parts they've used and more about how these parts come together to make a whole. How they've honed these parts and, looking past these obvious shared components, how the end product makes you feel. And for me, when I drive the Supra, I feel alive. There's a level of fun that belies the Supra's raw numbers. It might be down on power in comparison to the BMW Z4, but it actually has a quicker 0 to 60 time. It does it in 4.3 seconds, which is a tenth less. It also has the same amount of torque, 500 Newton meters. So every time you mash the pedal, it's an absolute event.
The Supra's handling has to be sensational if it's to be considered anything other than an unmitigated disaster, and the Supra lives up to expectations here. Toyota claims the car's wheelbase and track have a so-called golden ratio of 1.55 to 1. In other words, the proportions between the width and the length are, in their opinion, perfect.
Perfect is a strong word, but you've got to say, they've got a strong claim for that. People often talk about cars having a go-kart-like feel. This doesn't. This thing feels more like a fighter jet. It just feels super precise. The balance on this car is just outstanding. If the BMW Z4 is a bit of a blunt instrument, this thing is very much a scalpel.
The chassis feels incredibly taut and uncompromised. They say the body shell, which is steel and aluminium, is actually stiffer than the carbon shell in the LFA, and that doesn't sound like an exaggeration in the slightest. There's also a feeling of lightness and agility. Weirdly, the new Supra isn't much more powerful than the old model, but it is actually lighter. This is almost unheard of in a world where most modern cars weigh so much more than the models they replace.
It's not all perfect, of course. The brakes let this car down slightly. They are strong enough, they get the job done, but after a few laps of pounding around here at Jarama Circuit in Madrid, I've noticed they have started to fade ever so slightly. If you're thinking of tracking this thing, a brake upgrade might be in order.
The ZF automatic box is another disappointment. Most of the time it will give you exactly the gear you need, but it is extremely clinical and does leave you feeling quite detached from the action. When the rest of the package is this good, a manual box really would have been the icing on the cake.
Another slight concern for me is that the exhaust note, it could be better, couldn't it? It sounds fantastic in the open-top Z4, but here, with the roof, it's ever so slightly muted. But again, these are things you can fix in the aftermarket, and that's what the Supra is well known for.
Toyota hasn't given much of a damn about sports cars in recent times. They've been so focused on making hybrids, profits, and improving production methods that creating cars for fun has taken something of a backseat. They've been just as responsible for killing the sports car as any of us. But with the new Supra, they've made a spectacular return to form.
Questions still remain, of course. I find myself asking why you'd spend £50,000 on a Supra when you could have a more powerful BMW Z4, or a more practical, more aggressive M2 competition, or if you really want a driver's car, why you wouldn't just buy a car with a manual box. But these are rational questions, and this just isn't a rational car. If it were rational, it probably wouldn't even exist. And that's exactly why we need to celebrate it.
The Supra isn't perfect, but then again it never was, even in its prime. For me, it was always a pretty but slightly flawed machine that really came into its own once modified to the owner's specific taste. And maybe, especially in light of all the BMW influence, that's also the case here. The bottom line is that this is a very good sports car. The kind of sports car that should remind us that as a community, we need to start putting our money where our mouths are. Those of us that can afford to, of course. If we don't, then the end result is obvious. We might no longer get to enjoy them. For 2 decades, we've had to live in a world where a new Supra, and so many cars like it, don't exist. Now it's back, I for one think we should celebrate its return. After all, who wants to live in a world where cars like this are yesterday's news?